our next speaker is a young lady who's enlightened me a whole lot about the African American culture itself. Very in tune with things that, when you need to find information, she knows how to find it. She's just an all around scholarly, extremely busy young lady. Miss Denise Porter-Ross, would you please come up and share a few ideas with us?
Thank you, Mr. Hackley, Reverend Fincher, and audience. As I said, I'm Denise Porter-Ross, and by vocation, I am the Public Information Officer for the City of Fort Wayne. But as avocation, I also do a lot of work in the African American community on genealogy and understanding your heritage, because I firmly believe that the best way to find out where you're going is to understand where you've been, because we want to make sure that the young people that we have today have a good understanding of who we are and what we've done, whether we're African American, European American, Hispanic American. We've all come here because we're standing on the backs of others who had come before us. And from that, we owe it to them to reach to these higher heights, to continue our education, to continue to get back to our community so that our children can reach for the stars and make the opportunities that we could only dream of. In my particular family, my father actually was born in Fort Wayne in 1920. At that time, it was just a handful of African Americans that were actually native born in the Fort Wayne area. For those of you who are not that familiar with the Fort Wayne history, it's a little unusual in the Midwest because we were actually founded as a fort on Indian or Native American lands, okay, where the three rivers come together. The St. Mary's, the Maumee, and the St. Joe was an Indian village called Kikianga. The area that we now have a replica of the old fort is not quite in the place that it was historically, but that's just there to remind us that our roots come from a different time period. If you look at the Indiana history, most of Indiana was actually settled from the southern part up, from the Mississippi, or from the Ohio River and the area as Ohio began to dump from Illinois over into the Mississippi River. So we're a river boat type of mentality. Why Fort Wayne was so successful as an early fort was it was one of the areas where you could navigate the rivers that we had. Portage, or actually take your canoe across a short area from the Maumee and St. Mary's over to the Little Wabash, which eventually ran into the larger Wabash, which eventually ran into the Ohio and down into the Mississippi train. So a lot of our early heritage had to do with being a trading post. Okay. The earliest known African Americans in this particular community date back to the early 1800s, and there's no written record of them by name, but they are identified in some of the early records that we have where we were enumerating the population, which was just in the hundreds at that time. The African American population of our community exploded sometime after the, first after the Civil War, where we would just get perhaps 100 or so freedmen here. One of the things that's unusual to know in our particular state, at one time, African Americans had to actually pay a $500 bond to live as a free person in Allen County. So the people who were here 200 years ago were people who could self-sustain either by trades as blacksmiths, weavers, furriers, things of that nature, to be able to pay that bond to be a free man in this particular community. After the turn of the century and going into this is the turn of the 19th century, or the 20th century, so the 1900s, and going into the First World War, we began to see a migration of a lot of African American families from the southern areas to the northern states up to the Indiana area. A lot of people in the Fort Wayne area actually come from a couple of communities in Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Georgia. And some of those folks actually headed this way, perhaps on their way to Detroit or to Chicago, but found that they liked the size of the community, the lifestyle of the community, and they settled here. My father, James Porter, and his father, James Richard Porter, were some of those folks who settled here in the period after World War I. A lot of the names that you see in our history, the Whitcliffs, the Warfields, some of the other names of that nature, have been in this community for 100 years or more, and they also had the roots perhaps in the South or perhaps in the East, but found Fort Wayne to be a very comfortable place to live and grow a family. After World War II, we saw another explosion of the population due to another migration of more people coming to the Midwest from the southern communities. At that time in the Fort Wayne community, we were a very diverse community that had Harvester, or International Harvester, as the core of one of our major employers. We had 3 GE plants. We had a number of magnet wire plants, a lot of things that tended to revolve around supplying the Detroit automotive field. So it was plentiful for people who had the experience of hard work from the South, but the mindset of trying to build a better life for their children, which is one of the reasons why they moved north. So in the early periods of the 50s and 60s, Fort Wayne was like a mecca for a lot of working class and professional class African Americans. We found that that same pattern of migration actually happened with Hispanic Americans, with Americans from people who relocated here from Europe, so on and so forth. Of that, there may be someone else that can tell you a little bit more about their particular histories in this community. In the early 1950s, we actually had our first African American school teacher, Mrs. Feeney, who you can find some information at the African American Museum on Douglas Street about her particular role in this community. In that same period of time between World War II and the early 50s, we began to break the color barrier for a lot of other non-manual jobs. We received our first police officer and fire department person in the early 1950s. Okay. It was really even later than that then African Americans began to actually work in the secretarial or the administrative fields in the communities. So when we talk about good old days or the way it was, we realize that most of us are just a generation or two away from manual labor and from being products of someone from the South and perhaps someone with a slave heritage. One of the things that we've noticed in the last 25, 30 years or so is not only the large growth of the minority communities in our particular area, but we've also noticed the ability of the people who now live here to live and work in a variety of areas that were just foreign to their parents. When I was a child in Fort Wayne, my father and mother lived in an area of the community called Westfield. It's a little pocket of an area just south of Jefferson Street and about the Taylor Street area. Place a lot of people may know it as the Slater Steel area. Back then we called it Jocelyn Steel Mill and a couple of other names. But that was the place for African Americans to live, not only by choice, but by law. We were restricted to move into other parts of the community. When my parents bought a lot in 1965 off Lake Avenue, there was an African American doctor, Cecil Marshall, who actually had been the first person to buy a lot in that particular area. Another African American doctor, Dr. Theodore Borders was the first African American to buy a lot and build a house on North Anthony. That house still stands today. If you look at some of the covenants and bylaws and restrictions in our lease, and I have a copy of my particular lease as well, it would actually say in the lease, no Caucasian race can own this particular property. So in this particular community, we had de facto segregation because people tended to live in a particular area, but we also had segregation by law. It was part of your covenants or your deeds or your restrictions. You were prohibited to buy or own property in certain areas. Okay. At the same time that the laws began to change towards segregation of housing and housing patterns, we were also undergoing a lot of social changes in the area of education. One of the things that you may realize, if you have geographically an area that is segregated by law, there is no such thing as desegregated schools because the schools were following the patterns of the neighborhoods that we had. So in the late 60s, as the nation was beginning to look for ways of desegregating schools, the city of Fort Wayne actually found itself struggling with the same particular dilemmas. How do you desegregate schools when you have such a segregated housing pattern? The two were so entwined that it was very difficult to make the changes necessary on the educational field without also looking at the housing patterns themselves. Okay. A group of citizens at that time, led by Helen Brown, who the natatorium at Southside High School is named after, actually came up with several different compromises or programs or proposals that were looked at to desegregate schools in the Fort Wayne area. One of which was actually taking what we used to call the old Central High School and decommissioning it as a high school and then redirecting the population of the community in a radius sort of thing so that there was not a overwhelmingly minority or African American population in any one particular school. Now, over the years, we've grown up with the idea of people either having a choice of school, which was not the case, like I said, back in the 60s and before, or that we've had a fairly even amount of African Americans and other minorities throughout our school systems. If you begin to look at the statistics, though, we see that we are becoming very segregated again. It may be a self-segregated type of format. We have to ask ourselves, what does this generation need to do to change those types of patterns, okay? Are we actually taking advantage of some of the programs and some of the opportunities that our forefathers fought hard for us to have so that we can make the decisions to live in the neighborhoods that we choose to and to go to the schools that we would like to have our children in? One of the things that we also have to look at is making sure that when you're looking at neighborhoods, you're doing everything that you can to strengthen the neighborhoods. If someone is living in a home that may have been their legacy from their father before them, and it happens to be in an area that we call an urban area or an inner city area, they need to have some improvements available to maintain that home and keep that home up to standards. For example, in a lot of older homes, one of the problems is you have smaller lot sizes, okay, which means that you have less room to do some of the amenities that you may want to do without actually getting lots, vacant lots that might be on either side of your property so that you can add onto your homes. Another problem that you see with some of the older housing stock in our community would be that it may not be air conditioned. Now, you think that some of those homes are 100 years old or more, air conditioning was not a problem in the late 1800s or 1910. It is a necessity today to have an air-conditioned home. So we have to look for ways that we can help bring up that housing stock so that the people who choose to live there, we don't want to feel that people have to live somewhere that they don't want to, but for people who choose to live in the urban community can have the amenities to have a comfortable lifestyle in that particular home. Another concern that you have with some of the older homes is the number of restrooms, okay? In my lifetime, we have gone from a situation where I recall my grandparents in the South not having indoor plumbing at all to growing up in a house that had 4 or 5 people in it with 1 bathroom. And now we're at a point where we may have homes that have 3, 4, 5 bathrooms. In fact, we have more bathroom facilities than we have residents in some of our homes. Okay. It's very difficult for someone that has an older home to make those kinds of changes to the amenities to keep their house up to the standards that you may see in the suburban area, yet still stay committed to that homestead that they've had in that particular area. Okay. Another one of the things that we like to look at when we're building on our heritage and we're building on our legacy of what has come before us and where we want things to go is really looking at opportunities that we have to shape the government, to shape the community organizations, to shape the faith-based communities that are really shaping our community. I challenge those of you who are listening to take the opportunity to not only go to meetings of this nature, to stay involved with the community, but also to spend the time that's necessary to sit on boards, commissions, regulatory groups, so that your voice can be heard. As I've mentioned, it was a long struggle for a lot of our parents and our forefathers to come to this community to give us a better life. I don't want to see us throw away the advantages that we have gained over these years because we choose not to get involved. I applaud you for coming out tonight. I encourage you to stay involved and that we can give to our children opportunities that our parents had thought for us. Thank you. Oh, okay.
Okay. Got a couple questions here for you because you just kind of skimmed across a couple important points. Mm-hmm. As you're talking about the heritage of Fort Wayne, you did not talk about your mom.
Okay.
Tell us about her a little bit, about what her unique accomplishments were.
Okay. I actually have to speak about my mother and my father simultaneously because in the 1950s, my parents were tennis champs in Fort Wayne. My mother is actually in the Hall of Fame at the Wildwood Racquet Club and has been written about in several magazines and newspaper articles for achievements. I believe it was 5 tennis championships in a row.
And, curious, how did she get involved with tennis at a time when very few blacks were playing tennis?
Okay. My mother grew up in Mississippi, and actually my grandparents in Mississippi were college professors, and there was a tennis court on the campus there in Okolona College in Mississippi, which was an African-American school. Again, back then, schools were segregated, so they taught and lived on campus because they were African-American teachers, and that's where the job was, and that's what you do. So my grandfather actually taught all of his children to play tennis because he felt that it was the opportunity for them to be able to mix with other cultures, very similar to what we think of golf today. So my mother played tennis when she married my father after World War II. She taught him the game as an adult, and he actually became a tennis champ before she did.
Now, your grandparents in Mississippi, were they black or white?
They're black, African American. In fact, I mentioned before that I do a lot of genealogy information. On my grandmother's side, we can go back to a slave by the name of Abby Dean, who was born in 1835 and was brought to Mississippi as the slave of Hampt and Frank Dean, who both bedded her. They were the sons of the owner, and so she bore children by the slave master, very similar to some of the stories that you've seen from Roots and Queenie and things of that nature.
So who was it that was responsible for encouraging your grandparents to become educators? Because that's getting back closer to slavery time again, or
Exactly.
at slavery conditions anyway, and they had to have some slave owners over them or someplace there that were tolerable of blacks having education.
Okay. It's interesting to think in terms of a hierarchy in slavery, but I believe to a certain degree there may have been. Abby Dean, as I said, was bedded by her slave owners, so her children were too black to be white, too white to be black, but they may have had some advantages in being able to be around the master's other children when reading, writing, other lessons were going about. So they took advantage of that and then made sure that their children also learned to read and write. So education's gone back a number of years in my family. On the other side of my family, they were slaves to the then governor of Mississippi, Tillman Tucker. So if you're going to be a slave, I guess being a slave of a governor is probably better than being a slave to someone else that was not a landowner, but they still did not have the freedom to come and go and be what they wanted to be. In fact, my grandfather Simon, who took the name Tucker, was actually sold, what we call it, down the river. He was sold from Bowling Green, Kentucky, to go to work in Mississippi as a slave for the Tucker plantation.
And one more thing, what is the relevance of knowing all this? I mean, just like you mentioned early Fort Wayne years and talking about the Miamis and Kikianga and Chief Little Turtle, it was kind of interesting that you would mention that, because as I was reading history about my own family, I ran into a unique fact that Chief Little Turtle's granddaughter married Captain Hackley. So why is it relevant to, why is it relevant or curious, for you to go back and do that? I mean, a lot of people, young people especially today, say that was then, this is now, there's no connection.
In my family, we have a saying that we like to share, that there's but two things that we can leave our children. One is roots, the other is wings. I think it's very important that the more you know about your family and your heritage, the more you are inclined to give something to the next generation. As you've mentioned with your particular heritage and with mine, we are but one race. If you go back far enough in history, we all have had some heritage of one race or another, and we can be proud of all of that heritage that we have. But it's what we do now and in the future that's going to make the difference for our children and our community.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker